Welcome to Project 2. This is the project overview. It is very detailed to help you, but I'm not going to go through and read the whole thing. I just want to point out a couple things that we're going to need. The size of the album art, which will be 10 by 10 and 300 pixels per inch, and then the size of the images that we're going to curate from Pixabay that need to be at least 1,000 pixels on their short side. So those are some important pieces of information that I need to keep in mind as I'm showing you how to download images from Pixabay. So let's go over to Pixabay. This is what it looks like, and it has a normal search bar. You can search anything you want. I'm going to go ahead and type in painting because that's one of the examples that I used. Right here is the image that I chose. And directly here on the right, you can see free download. It's always going to default to the third size, but notice that 1295 pixels, that would be big enough because it's over 1,000 pixels on the smaller side. So that's important. I can go ahead and click download, and that'll be downloading to my downloads folder on my computer. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab some other images. I'll type in some stars. Here's a lovely image of the Milky Way starry galaxy. Again, you'll note that it's defaulting to that third option. You can always grab the fourth option if you want, if you have a free account. So I do, so I'm going to go ahead and download the bigger option. Let's also grab a Labrador puppy. Can't go wrong with lab puppies. Lots of great images here to work with, but I want to pick one that has pretty strong contrast with the background. There's one up here on the top right that has already been isolated. This one's been isolated as well, and you'll notice that it's on a transparent background. That could be helpful, but I'm going to select this one because I'm going to show you guys how to pull that puppy away from its background. So I'm going to download that. I'm going to go ahead and go to Photoshop so that I can show you how to open your images. All you need to do is hit File, Open, find the folder where those images have been placed, and then click on an image. Now you can always double check the image size to make sure that everything is as you want it to be. Simply go to Image, Image Size, and you'll notice once again that the resolution is in 300 pixels per inch, which is what we want, and that the dimensions are over 1,000 pixels for the smaller side. So we're good on that. I'm going to hit OK. And I'll just take you through some of the things that you can do in Photoshop. A lot of this is what you're going to learn in the tutorials, but I'll show you my own process. The first thing I always do is go into the window, open the layers, and you can throw the layers here on the right so that it'll stay there. I usually rename the background to Original, hit OK. Create a new layer. I'll be doing some edits on that layer, but before I do anything else, I'm also going to click this Original on the right-clicking it, and hit Duplicate Layer. And then I'll have an original copy. It's just another safeguard to make sure that I have an original that I can go back to. Okay, now I'm going to go over to the image adjustments, and this is basically where you're going to live when you are making your adjustments to your images. And you can select any of these. I'll show you real quick hue and saturation. This is what I used to change the colors of this painting. And I'll simply slide the hue a little bit. Sometimes the saturation seems to increase when you change the hue because the colors are more contrasted. And of course you can also up that saturation, but I'll go ahead and just hit OK. And there are other things you can do to change the color of the image as well. Color balance is another one of my favorites. It's a little more subtle than hue saturation, so you're basically just telling the different opposite colors, cyan, red, magenta, green, yellow, and blue, to come out. You can adjust these for the shadows, midtones, and highlights. Alright, I'm also going to show you what curves looks like. Now, curves is generally used to create more contrast. Normally it starts with a straight line like this, but you can create what's called the S curve, and that'll make it more contrasted than it was before. You can toggle this preview back and forth to see the difference. I don't love the way it looks when I make this particular image more contrasted, so you can also make more of an outward bow curved or an inward bow curved, and it'll change the contrast of these elements as well as brightening up certain ones of those colors. I'll leave it there and hit OK. So image adjustments, what else? You can also look at this black and white. This is an interesting one, especially with an image like this. Note that when I toggle the different colors, the way that the image is turning into a black and white changes drastically. So this is a great option if you want to have more control when you're turning an image into black and white compared to going image, mode, grayscale, for example. Another thing you can do is change the channel mixer. This is similar to changing the color balance, but it's a little more intense. So you're looking at just red, green, and blue, which are the different channels that are making up this image because it's an RGB image, and you're changing the intensity of those. You're not changing them with highlights, midtones, and shadows. You're just changing the image as a whole. Thanks to a lot of photo editing software on our phones, you're probably used to a lot of these. So exposure, that's very common on phones. You get a good feel for it, and offset with gamma correction. And a lot of these are things that you can play with, just see how the changes are made, and you can hit Command Z or Edit Undo if you don't like something you did. Now another thing I want to show you is under Filter. If you go to Pixelate, Color Halftone, and these are some adjustments that you can change, but I'll leave it at 8 for now. Hit OK. This is going to create a color halftone, very popular in modern art, and that's something that you may want to explore when you're making your album art. And just so that you know about the radius change, if I make this into a smaller number, it's going to create a smaller dot, which is going to make the image a little more clear to see. And of course you can change the dot so that it's higher, which will make the image even more obscure. Let's go ahead and talk about the lasso tool and the marquee tools, just going over some of these different selection options that you have. If you use the regular rectangular marquee tool and draw a rectangle by holding down your cursor, it's just going to create a rectangle, and you'll see the selection with the marching ants. You can hit select, deselect, and if you do the same thing but you hold down the shift key this time, you're going to see that it makes a perfect square as opposed to a rectangle. Okay. And the same thing is true for the elliptical version. If you just draw something, you'll see an oval, but if you draw something while holding down the shift key, you'll create a perfect circle. So that's just something to know in regards to your shift key if you're using a Mac. You also can play around with the lasso tool. Now the lasso tool is very freeform. You can draw any shape that you want and it's going to listen to you. And the other versions of the lasso tool are a little different. Polygonal lasso tool is going to rely on straight lines. So anywhere I pull that cursor, it's going to create a straight line, and then when I click down, it's going to drop an anchor essentially, and it'll just follow those points until I finish my shape. Now the magnetic lasso tool is unique in that it's going to be listening to the image itself. So if I start over here on this pink shape and I start to drag away, it's basically just tracing that pink shape to the best of its ability. Alright, so I can continue clicking throughout so that those anchors are set in place and that the selection doesn't sort of jump or toggle as I get farther away from an anchor point, and I finish up my selection, and there you have it. This can be really helpful for something that has a very crisp edge compared to its outline. Alright, let me show you something else. If I make a selection and I copy it and I paste it on this extra layer that I've made, you'll notice that it comes in with a little bit of a fuzzy edge. Okay, the reason it's doing that is this feather up here. Notice that it's at 10 px, 10 pixels. It means that it's creating a feathering of those 10 pixels, and it's not going to be a super clean, crisp edge. Now I can change that feather to any number that I want, higher or lower. I can make it back down to 0, and then the selection that I make when I paste a new selection from a copy is going to be a pure crisp edge. And I can toggle these layers away by clicking on these eyeballs and just see the different information that I want to see. So if I want to copy this and paste this onto my new layer, I can get rid of my bottom layer and see how those circles interact with that original down there at the bottom. Okay, so that's just interesting to see. And I'm going to create another layer real quick. I'm going to go over here to the paint bucket tool and just click on my layer, and it's going to fill with this color. Okay. What's great about this is that I can fill with a color and I can change the color at any time. I can also do this by hitting Edit Fill. I just prefer to use the paint bucket tool. I can change my color and then change the blending mode. So over here on the right, you'll see that it says normal. It just means that that layer is reacting normally to the layer beneath it. So if I filled it with a solid color, it's going to be solid. But all these other blending modes change the way that layer interacts with the layer underneath. So as if it were soft light, vivid light, linear light, all of these different things. And it's a great way to play with all of the different changes you've already made, but once you get your selections isolated, you can decide, oh, I want everything to be a little bit cooler or a little more muted, and it's just another really quick way to edit information as a whole. And again, you can keep changing the color until you see something that you like. Let's say I really like the way that I've ended up with these circles, but I just want the circles and I don't want the extra layer of color. How would I get them? The easiest way is to merge the layers. So you can select multiple layers at once by holding down the Shift key and then continue to click the layers underneath and then right click and scroll down a little bit and you'll see merge layers here at the bottom. Okay, merge layers. Now everything is on a single layer. You can see I can toggle the eyeball back and forth. And now I'm going to show you another selection option. This is select by color range. So I can use this little dropper tool and select any color. If I select the green, you'll see the greens pop up. This is a little thumbnail over here on the right. And the fuzziness is just a way to change the tolerance. So I've changed the tolerance down to low. I've selected that darker color, and that selected everything that was navy, but by selecting the inverse, I select those circles. Now I hit edit copy, and I want to paste them into an album art file. So I'll hit new, make that 10 inches by 10 inches. It's in 300 resolution. That's what I want. RGB color is good. And I'm going to make the background transparent. It's just another way to safeguard my options here. I can always add a layer and quickly fill that with white and just use that as my reference, but I still have that transparent background to work with if I want. Now I'm going to add a new layer. I'm going to go ahead and rename my layers as I'm adding them. Change that to background, change this to circle since that's what I'm adding, and then I'll just paste those in. Okay, I can toggle this around, move it. I can also change the size of it by hitting transform scale. Simply pull that rectangle out that appears, and when I have it to the size that I want, I hit enter. The problem with doing this, the concern really, is that it may have made this pixelated. So the way you check that is to hit view 100%. And yes, clearly that edge is pixelated at this point. Some of that resolution has been compromised. So I'm going to undo that, and basically this is the size that it's going to come in, and that's the resolution that it's going to be stuck in order for that edge to be clear. And this makes sense given that the image when we started was a little bit over 1,000, but barely. It had the resolution of 300, but that's the entire image. Alright, this big rectangle. And all I'm copying are these two little circles, so I can't expect to scale them up to be the size of the rectangle itself and for their compositional integrity to be preserved. So that's what I'm stuck with in terms of the size of the circle, and again, the bigger the image that you use to start with, the more options you have with scaling. Let's go ahead and open this little puppy dog real quick, and let's talk about a few things that the puppy can teach us. When we are selecting just the puppy dog, we have a few options that we've already talked about. We could try selecting our color range and using this background. Notice I'm not getting anything because I need to increase my fuzziness. But once I do that, it's not just picking up the background, you'll see it's also picking up some of the puppy dog itself because the puppy dog is light in color just like this background. So this option really isn't going to work. So the next option is probably the lasso tools. You could use the magnetic lasso tool, but I've been doing this long enough that I'm pretty comfortable with just the freeform lasso tool. Now I can change the feather before I get started, and I'm going to go ahead and leave it at 3. I think that'll be pretty good in terms of a little bit of blur around the edge, but not so much that it's very obvious, just to give it a little fluffy, fuzzy effect. I'm just going around the shape of this dog, and again, an image like this makes it pretty easy because it's such a clear contrast to the background someone else has already done. And I'm just tracing around this shape as best of my ability. Now, of course, no one's perfect. I'm not perfect, and you have to do the selection in one swipe. So if I were to make a mistake, then I would either have to restart or compromise for that. Now I'm just going to make a mistake intentionally right here to show you what I can do to take care of that after the fact once I've finished the entire selection. I'm going to speed this process up just to show you what happens at the end. Coming up to the end of my selection and releasing, there we go. It's not perfect, and especially with this mistake over here, it's something I need to correct. Now notice if I hit the Option key, this little minus sign pops up next to my lasso tool. If I hold that Option key down and then complete a selection the same way I just did, it will get rid of that part of the selection. And the same thing can be done with the Shift key, adding a selection. So if there was a little chunk of the puppy that I cut in too far on, I can use the Shift key and then go back in there and grab a little bit more of that area, and it's going to add that to the selection. So you've got a little bit of options in terms of correcting any mistakes that you made. I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer and paste it, and there you have your puppy. And that can be really helpful to see your mistakes a little bit more clearly when they're not on the background. Okay, so I'm just going to go in here and using my selection tool, get rid of some of that by selecting it and then hitting delete. And I still have the original in the background in case I truly mess up, but you can always hit edit, undo. Now I'm going to go into the adjustments, show you again. This is levels. It's very similar to curves. So I can change the levels of this puppy. I can also change the hue saturation. We've already talked about this. Let's see, I'll make this puppy a little blue. Maybe he's feeling blue today. Alright, so we've changed him. He's got a little dusty blue, but maybe he needs to be more blue. I'll go into the color balance. Again, making these opposite colors a little more intense, changing the midtones and the highlights. It's probably good, but maybe I will touch up the shadows as well. He's looking a little bright at this point, a little unnaturally bright, so I'll go into these shadows and try and even out a little bit of the value contrast, the value pattern of this puppy, and I'll hit OK. So now I have a blue puppy that is completely isolated from his background, and he's perfectly ready to be brought in as collage material into my album art. So I'm going to have this layer selected, make sure I'm not on the background, just in this first layer, and I can hit select all because he's on a transparent background, edit copy, and paste him into the album art, and there he is. And I can rearrange this element of the puppy dog and then go over to the circles layer, move that as well, and begin to think about how these elements are going to interact in my composition. Okay, now let's say I need to make another layer and I want to do what I did with the circles and give a color to this composition that's going to interact with the other colors and hopefully tie them together a little bit. It's on multiply as a blending mode, as you can see, and that is one of my favorite blending modes. It doesn't change the interaction of the layers too strongly. It's a little subtle, but still offers a little bit of a contribution in terms of color. Alright, so now we have this nice multiply layer, and I'm going to open one more image, the Milky Way, the stars that I grabbed from Pixabay. And this one I think I will go ahead and make in black and white. We've discussed this. I'm going to change the reds and yellows. They're probably not going to do a whole lot because this is mostly a blue image. So let's go down to the blue. Aha, there we go. Now we're seeing some change there. And I'm just going to make it into a little bit of a speckle basically. And rather than it being just black and white, maybe I'll just change it to more of a gray. Alright, this will work. Now if I were to just copy this layer, you'll see it comes in as blue. So in order to copy the galaxy with the layer above it and get the interaction of these two layers together, I have to hit edit, copy, merge. Again, if it's just this layer and I hit copy and I paste it, solid blue. Alright. But if I go edit, copy, merged, paste, we have the two layers together in one layer now and working as a unit. I can then change the blending mode of this layer, and we're seeing some sparkles come through in the puppy dog and some really interesting things going on. And when you found a blending mode that you like, know that you can also change the opacity, which is basically going to make it a little more transparent and less strong of an effect. You can also duplicate the layer, because why settle for one blending mode? And you can choose another one that will change it a little bit differently. So for example, rather than just having those sparkles in the background, I can change the blending mode so that they also appear inverted in the puppy dog and the balls themselves. Then I get a full range of information. See, there's little light ones on the dog and darker ones in the background. So those are the basics in terms of layers and copying and pasting elements. But of course you also have the paintbrush that you can work with Photoshop. And everything should be in a new layer, so I'm going to make a new layer, and there are some brushes in here to work with. And you can also just change the size of the paintbrush. Right here, if you pull the paintbrush onto the composition, you can see a preview of the size just in the little shape that shows up on the composition before you even start painting. And I'm going to go back into the brush, change the size to be a little bit bigger. You can also change the blending mode before you start painting, but once you're done painting, you can also go over here to the right and change the blending mode of the entire layer. So let's say I pick Linear Dodge Add, you'll see that that brightens everywhere that I've painted with the paintbrush, and I can still continue to paint. I don't have to stop, and all of the different choices that I've made in terms of the size of the paintbrush, the particular paintbrush I've used, and that blending mode are still going to be applied. Okay. There are even more paintbrushes available in this paintbrush folder, so you have a lot more choices in here, and you can still go in and change the size, of course. This is a really big kind of sponge brush situation, and this is really fun to just go in and see what the different paintbrushes are, see how they affect your composition. You can also select a paintbrush, click on the composition, and then holding down your shift key, click again, and it'll create a perfectly straight line if that interests you. So I'm basically just playing at this point with all of these different paintbrush options, and of course I can create a new layer, change the color that I'm working with. So that'll change the way that my color and my paintbrush are interacting with the composition. And again, you always have the option to go and change the blending mode after the fact as well. So that one's really interesting because it makes our puppy dog a little darker blue. I could accentuate certain elements of the puppy dog just by brushing over his ears, making them even darker blue, accentuating his eyes a little bit. Super cute puppy dog. And over in my background area, it also makes that a little bit darker. So to save this, I would hit File, Save As, and it needs to be a Photoshop file. It probably will as a default, and layers needs to be checked as it is in this example. I can call this Album Heart 1 and hit OK. That way all my layers will be preserved. But when I hit File, Save As, and change the format to JPEG, it's going to flatten the image. So I can hit Save, make sure that the large file is selected, and hit OK. Then I can hit File, New, change the size to 10 by 10, 300 resolution, RGB color, transparent, OK, and I can do the whole process again for my second 2 and 3 songs. Now these other files that I have open, I need to save those as well. Good practice is to save as you go. But as you're saving, just make sure again that the Photoshop is selected and that layers are checked. Because if they're not, it'll save as a JPEG, it'll be flat, and you won't be able to reaccess those layers, meaning that you won't be able to go back in and see the original and make edits to your changes. So I'm going to go through and make sure that all of this is saved, as I just told you, with the Photoshop selected and layers. I'm going to call these by their descriptions. So Blue Puppy saved as a Photoshop document, the Milky Way saved as a Photoshop document with layers, hit OK. Here are my circles. I will hit File, Save As, Circles, Photoshop format, layers is checked, OK. And now I can go into this folder where all of this information has been and organize it a little bit. So my photos, as I originally curated them from Pixabay, need to be in a folder in and of themselves, so I'll just slip those in there. I also need a folder to show my photo edits, so I'll have edited photos, painting, Milky Way, Blue Puppy, slip in those, and then these can hang out here. All of this can go into a folder called Project 2, my name, take everything in there, and then I need to compress this file. I also would slip in, of course, my research, my thumbnails, but I don't have that to show you on here on this tutorial. Once that folder gets fully compressed, you'll see it'll take a while because it's really heavy with imagery. that is the file that you will ultimately submit for project 2. And once that's done, then you will be entirely completed with the project. So congratulations.